Dr. Vincent Hale's last known footsteps echoed through the empty hallway of St. Merida Memorial Hospital in downtown Seattle on the night of October 17, 1981. A storm rolled over the city, sending flickers of lightning across the glass facade of the aging hospital. Inside, it was quieter than usual. 2 patients were asleep in the trauma ward. A single nurse sat behind the main desk, reading a romance novel under a flickering lamp. The morgue elevator dinged once. Then, silence. Hale had just completed his rounds on the 2nd floor and was scheduled to take over an emergency intake that never arrived. He scribbled a few notes into a patient's chart, set his pen down, and disappeared. No one noticed until 2:36 a.m. when Nurse Valerie Jenkins realized the trauma charts hadn't been updated. She walked toward the on-call room expecting to find him asleep. The room was empty. His stethoscope was on the desk, his white coat folded over the chair. His car keys were still in the coat pocket. At first, she assumed he had stepped out for air. After all, Vincent was known for his late-night pacing around the perimeter parking lot whenever he needed to clear his mind. But by sunrise, it was clear something was wrong. Security combed through the hospital. Cameras from that era recorded grainy black and white footage in 1-minute intervals. One camera caught Hale entering the basement level near the morgue. The next minute showed nothing. Just the empty corridor and the morgue door ajar. No sign of him exiting. No one came in or out. It was as if he had stepped into the darkness and dissolved. The police were called at 6:04 a.m. They treated the case like a simple missing persons report at first. No signs of a struggle. No forced entry or exit. The initial assumption was that Vincent had walked out and chosen to disappear. Perhaps the pressures of his job had finally cracked him. He had, after all, been working triple shifts and taking grief counseling after a failed resuscitation earlier that year that had deeply shaken him. But those who knew him best scoffed at the idea. Vincent was meticulous, deeply committed, and emotionally anchored despite the stresses of his work. He was not someone who vanished voluntarily. His wife, Laura, refused to believe he would leave her or their 6-year-old son Nathan. Her voice cracked during press conferences, holding up Vincent's picture as if her sheer will could pull him back from wherever he had gone. 3 weeks later, the case went cold. The only oddity was a single red thread found near the morgue drawer handle. It was logged as incidental. With no body, no signs of foul play, and no confirmed sightings, the police had little to go on. Eventually, attention shifted. Other cases emerged. The world moved on. Laura never stopped searching. Every year, she left a birthday card on his old locker in the hospital's staff room. In the years that followed, Vincent became a ghost in the minds of those who had worked with him. A name spoken in whispers. A photograph fading in the hall of distinguished physicians. The hospital underwent 3 different administrative overhauls. Technology improved. Wards changed. The basement floor was eventually decommissioned after flooding damaged the electrical system. Still, no one dared to remove the old morgue drawers. They were built into the wall, industrial and cumbersome, left to rust beneath fluorescent flickers and the smell of mildew. Then, 43 years later, in the spring of 2024, the city sold the property to a private firm planning to renovate the site into a biotech research facility. Contractors were brought in to inspect the lower levels. Most of the old fixtures were removed without issue. But one drawer, drawer 9C in the northeast corner, would not budge. Welded shut by time or corrosion, it resisted crowbars and electric saws. An intern named Miles Carter, barely 24 and fresh from his first job at the demolition firm, was tasked with cataloging the morgue drawers. He noted the stuck one, marked it for further inspection, and moved on. 2 days later, the head of the project asked an external specialist to examine the morgue section, hoping to avoid costly delays. A woman named Tara Connors, with experience in historical building preservation, arrived with a quiet demeanor and sharp eyes. As she ran her hand along the face of the stuck drawer, she paused. There were tiny scratches around the lock. Recent ones. Almost invisible. She tapped the metal, listened. It sounded hollow, then padded. Not empty. Something was inside. Something that muffled sound. Something that had been there for a very, very long time. When she requested the drawer be opened carefully, she added one peculiar note to her formal recommendation. The hospital's last record of anyone accessing the morgue drawer area had been in October 1981. The name on the access log was Dr. Vincent Hale. Stage 2. The Fading Trail. Tara Connors stood quietly in the dim basement of the former St. Merida Memorial Hospital, her fingers brushing against the rusted lip of drawer 9C. The air was thick with dust and moisture, every breath tasting faintly of old copper and damp cement. The contractors around her were indifferent, focused on deadlines and budgets, but something about the drawer's refusal to open gnawed at her instincts. It was not just the resistance of corroded metal. It felt like a boundary was being guarded, not by locks or hinges, but by something older, something unseen yet deliberate. She documented her findings in a formal report and forwarded it to the City Historical Preservation Committee. Her wording was precise. The drawer may contain organic material. Protocol requires non-invasive entry, supervised by forensic authorities. Within days, local law enforcement authorized a controlled opening of the drawer, partnering with a state forensic team due to the age and possible significance of its contents. The scene was set with an almost surgical level of care. 2 officers monitored the entry point. A forensic analyst calibrated her equipment. Tara stood nearby, arms folded, watching with attention she could not explain. When the panel was finally loosened, the stale air that hissed outward was so old it seemed to echo with something ancient. Inside, the silhouette of a human body lay curled in on itself, encased in what appeared to be a brittle cloth wrapping that had fused with the body's outer layer over time. The figure was skeletal but oddly well-preserved, skin like parchment still clinging to bones. What caught everyone's attention was not just the body itself, but the hospital badge pinned to the front of the tattered shirt. The ID read Dr. Vincent Hale, photo faded but unmistakable. The room grew quiet. Officers exchanged glances. Tara felt her chest tighten. After 43 years, Vincent Hale had been found, and he had never left the building. What followed was a whirlwind of media attention. Old reporters dusted off cold files. Former nurses and doctors gave tearful interviews. Laura Hale, now in her 70s, had never remarried. Her voice cracked during the press conference as she spoke of her husband, her hands trembling as she held the badge they had given her for confirmation. Yet the answers were not forthcoming. The autopsy revealed stunning anomalies. The body showed no signs of trauma or decomposition consistent with the timeline. He had not died in 1981. The forensic pathologist concluded he had been alive for at least 3 additional days after the recorded disappearance. That revelation shifted the tone of the investigation. What had been assumed a tragic case of a man breaking down under pressure became something stranger, darker, more unresolved. There was a fresh scar across the ribcage, long healed by the time of death, suggesting medical interference. But it had been stitched with a coarse black thread, not surgical grade, not hospital standard. More puzzling was the presence of a botanical compound in the remnants of his bloodstream, an exotic chemical derived from a rare plant found only in certain regions of Southeast Asia. The compound was known historically for its use in tribal sedative rituals, now considered obsolete in modern medicine. The detectives on the case began to question every detail of the hospital's history. Who had access to the morgue? Why had no one noticed the sealed drawer? And who had administered the plant compound if it was never available in the United States? The answers did not come from official records. They came from memory, reluctant whispers among retired staff, and one particular testimony from a former nurse named Dana Ortiz, now living in Arizona. Her name had appeared in multiple mentions in Vincent's personal notes. When contacted, she hesitated to speak, requesting that her interview remain off the record. Over a slow phone connection, her voice cracked with hesitation. She said there was a nurse on staff at that time, a woman named May Lynn Park, who had recently immigrated from Hong Kong. She was soft-spoken, intensely private, and possessed extensive knowledge of Eastern herbal medicine. Vincent had taken an interest in her background, even defending her when others criticized her unconventional methods. According to Dana, May Lynn vanished only a year after Vincent's disappearance, citing a family emergency and never returning. Her personnel file was thin, her departure logged as voluntary. The investigators dug deeper, accessing travel records, immigration files, and employment data, but May Lynn Park had left little trace behind. It was as if her life evaporated the moment she exited the hospital. Then came another turn. In the corner of an old administrative storage room on the hospital's 3rd floor, tucked beneath layers of dust-covered forms, A junior officer found an unmarked envelope. Inside were photographs, grainy and discolored, showing various patients in what appeared to be altered states of consciousness. One photograph, in particular, stood out. It was taken in the basement level. A man sat on a gurney, his eyes closed, a black thread sewn into his chest. The man was unmistakably Vincent Hale. Behind him, almost in shadow, stood a figure. A woman in a nurse's uniform, her face obscured but her frame and hairstyle matching Mei Lin's personnel photo. The evidence was circumstantial but chilling. Someone had drugged Hale, stitched him, and left him to die inside a sealed drawer. But why? Theories began to mount. One suggested Vincent discovered something he was not supposed to know. Perhaps an experimental treatment, or an unauthorized operation involving high-risk patients. Others whispered of cult-like activity among a small group of staff obsessed with Eastern medicine, ritual, and transcendence. These ideas were labeled fringe by officials, yet in every cold case room and midnight conversation, the lines blurred. Nothing explained why Vincent was kept alive, sedated, and hidden in plain sight for days before his death. Why was he not simply killed or released? What was the purpose of the ritualistic stitching? The official stance from the police department was cautious. The case remained open. They reclassified it from disappearance to homicide. No suspects were publicly named. But inside the department, one name kept resurfacing in old memos and third-hand accounts. A hospital administrator named Gerald Cross. He had been quietly committed to a private psychiatric institution in late 1983, just 2 years after Hale vanished. No charges, no scandal, just a transfer, a resignation letter, and a sealed medical file. As Tara Connors reviewed the stack of old documents late into the night, she circled Gerald's name with a red pen. Then, she circled a second name. A patient admitted under the alias Victor Hall in 1984, treated for severe psychological trauma in a private ward north of Tacoma. Victor Hall bore no official relation to Vincent Hale, but his intake photograph bore an eerie resemblance to a man 40 pounds thinner, with dead eyes and a stitched scar across his chest. Tara leaned back in her chair, heart pounding. Someone had assumed Vincent's identity, or Vincent had survived long enough to be institutionalized under a new name. Either way, the trail was not just fading. It was reshaping. The morning fog settled low over the city as Tara Connors sat in her car across from the aging structure that had once been St. Merida Memorial Hospital. The building looked hollow now, stripped of its dignity, its empty windows like open mouths gasping at the sky. Her laptop buzzed beside her, still glowing with the intake photo of Victor Hall. She stared at the screen, the eerie resemblance to Vincent Hale impossible to ignore. The scar across the chest, the sunken eyes, the slight slant of the jawline, they were not just coincidences. She had requested additional files from the psychiatric facility that had once treated Victor Hall, but the process was stalled. Most of the files were sealed due to privacy regulations, and the facility had shut down in 1996 after a string of malpractice lawsuits. Tara's contacts at the city archives found that Gerald Cross, the administrator whose name kept surfacing, had once been a trustee at the same facility. That detail had not been in any of the official records. She leaned back against her seat, the fog outside thickening, the building slowly vanishing behind the vapor like a memory refusing to be summoned. When she returned to the site 2 days later, the air inside the morgue was cooler than she remembered. The workers had moved on to other sections of the building, leaving the basement unmonitored, its silence thick and undisturbed. She walked down the corridor slowly, past the remnants of old equipment, through layers of time and decay. Her boots echoed faintly on the concrete. The drawer had been resealed for evidence purposes, marked with yellow tape, and a new forensic tag hung from the latch. She crouched beside it, ran her fingers along the edge, and listened. There was no sound. She was not expecting a sound. But still, something in her body remained tense. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small pocket recorder. Not to speak into, but to place on the ground near the drawer. She activated the audio sensor and stepped back. For 5 minutes, she stood there in silence, listening to nothing but the distant hum of city life filtering through the ground. Then, a faint click. A rustle, like fabric shifting in a sealed container. She blinked, leaned in, but the sound stopped. The recorder confirmed it later. Anomalous noise. No source. No draft. Nothing natural. Tara submitted the audio to the forensic team without explanation. She simply labeled it Drawer 9C. That same week, she received a brown envelope in her office mailbox. No sender. Inside was a single photograph. Black and white, heavily blurred, showing a surgical table inside the hospital's original operating theater. On the table, a man's body lay under a sheet, his head turned slightly to the side. Standing behind him was Gerald Cross, clearly younger, clearly tense, his eyes staring directly at the camera. In the background, another figure, partially obscured by a metal tray card, appeared to be a woman, her face turned away, but her hair in the familiar style Tara had seen in May Lynn Park's outdated personnel file. On the back of the photograph was a date stamped faintly in red ink. October 20th, 1981, 3 days after Vincent's disappearance. Tara brought the photo to the police, and for the first time, the lead detective assigned to the reopened case looked visibly disturbed. The date did not match any recorded operation. The room had not been in regular use after 1978 due to equipment modernization. Someone had kept it open. Someone had used it. And someone had taken a photograph meant never to be found. Meanwhile, pressure built from the media. National outlets had picked up the story. A cold case doctor found dead in his own hospital drawer was compelling enough. The deeper elements, the scar, the compound, the missing nurse, and the psychiatric patient with no verifiable origin, all hinted at something larger. Laura Hale refused interviews. She remained secluded, her health deteriorating under the weight of old grief made new. Her son Nathan, now in his 40s, emerged briefly to plead for discretion, asking the press to let the authorities do their work. But the questions kept growing. Who kept Vincent alive for those days? Why sedate him instead of kill him? Why the stitch, the botanical compound, the identity switch? Why hide him instead of dispose of him? Answers eluded them until a tech analyst named Dana Abrams, reviewing old hospital server backups, discovered a corrupted file buried in a directory labeled Maintenance Logs 1981. The file contained scanned notes, presumably intended to be destroyed. Among them, a typed document titled Behavioral Enhancements Preliminary Trial Phase 1. The document was incomplete, water-damaged, with entire sections blurred beyond recognition. But what was legible outlined a series of trials using natural compounds derived from Southeast Asian plants aimed at altering memory retention, emotional regulation, and submission reflexes. One subject listed as male subject A displayed marked decline in verbal resistance and physiological autonomy over a 72-hour period. The date aligned with Vincent Hale's disappearance. The initials at the bottom of the report were GC and MP Gerald Cross. May Lynn Park. The hospital's official statement following these revelations was measured. They acknowledged historical mismanagement. They condemned any unauthorized experimentation. They promised transparency. But the institution no longer existed in legal form. The facility had been sold. The records, fragmented. The people involved, either dead, vanished, or discredited. Still, a subpoena was issued for the estate of Gerald Cross, and a search of his last known residence in Olympia yielded a locked chest in the attic, beneath stacks of theological books, and a rusted trunk filled with nursing uniforms. Inside the chest were 3 items: a reel of 8mm film, a journal, and a brass key labeled OB Theater East. The film, when digitized and stabilized, showed footage taken in the old operating theater. A man, bound to a table, his face obscured. Around him stood 3 figures in surgical masks, none speaking. The footage was silent. One of the figures, based on height and build, matched the photograph of Gerald. Another moved with a subtle limp, matching old records of May Lynn's healed leg fracture. The third was unknown. The film cut after 9 minutes, ending in a sudden flare of light, as if the reel had burned out. The journal, however, held more detail. Written in Gerald's hand, it documented a belief in neural transcendence, the use of natural compounds to unlock dormant consciousness. He described Vincent as a skeptic, resistant at first, then pliable. The final entry simply read, "He opened his eyes before the final hour. He saw the third. I fear he knew. We sealed him." The brass key, when tested, fit the rusted door of the East Operating Theater, sealed since 1984. When police broke it open, they found it undisturbed. Dust lay evenly over every surface, except one. A single chair, placed in the center of the room, facing an old surgical lamp that still hung overhead. On the chair sat a recording device, old and rusted, but intact. The cassette inside was labeled the third. The device was old and fragile, its cassette compartment slightly rusted at the edges, the button stiff and unresponsive at first touch. One of the technicians used compressed air to clear the dust, then carefully inserted a backup battery module designed to mimic the old voltage systems. The machine clicked, hissed, then whirred softly to life. Everyone in the room stood still as the playback began. At first, the only sound was static, a long droning tone broken by occasional scratches like the scraping of a chair on cement. Then came a voice, soft at first, distant, almost unintelligible. It was a male voice, shaky, breathless, and it repeated the same phrase 3 times. They said the third is watching. The third is watching. The third is watching. A long pause followed. The tape crackled again, and this time the voice sounded closer. It spoke haltingly, as though each word required effort. I was awake the whole time. I remember the lamp. I remember the smell. I remember her face. She was crying when she stitched me. She said it was necessary. She said I would understand later. Then silence again, for nearly 2 minutes. Just as one of the officers reached for the stop button, the voice resumed, louder now, more desperate. He is not who you think. He wore my name. He wore my face. But he was never me. The woman, the one with the T, she knew. She hid the real files. She marked them with stars. That was how she kept them apart. You must find the stars. It ended with a sound none of them could place. Not quite a scream, not quite mechanical, but something in between. The technician pulled the cassette out and handed it to evidence control, but everyone in that room left a little quieter than they had entered. Tara Connors took notes in her worn leather journal, her mind spinning. This was not just a ritual. This was an identity theft on a cellular level. Someone had assumed Vincent Hale's name, possibly lived as him, possibly even convinced others that he was still alive, all while the real Vincent lay hidden in a morgue drawer just 1 floor beneath. The implications were staggering. If Gerald Cross and May Lynn Park had manipulated memories, altered perceptions, and controlled records, then how many other identities could have been manipulated over the years? That night, Tara did not sleep. She sat in her apartment, the tape replaying in her head. The mention of stars stuck with her. She recalled the archive room on the 5th floor of the old hospital, long since cleared out, but possibly still hiding forgotten documents. The next morning, she convinced the lead investigator to allow her access. The room was dusty and cold, filled with toppled filing cabinets and stacks of worked paper. On the far wall was a rusted shelving unit, mostly empty, except for a row of thin cardboard folders marked with faded ink. She scanned the spines, most illegible, until she noticed one with faint symbols drawn in the upper corner. A 5-pointed star, repeated 3 times in black ink. She pulled it from the shelf, brushed off the dust, and opened it carefully. Inside were documents typed on yellowed paper. Each page bore the hospital's official header, but none of the pages were filed in any known index. The first document detailed a procedure labeled Deep Cognitive Realignment. The language was clinical, but the meaning was clear. The procedure involved exposure to specific sound frequencies, mild hallucinogens derived from plants, and prolonged sensory isolation. The goal was to suppress the original identity and allow a constructed persona to take root. The subject listed in the file was coded as VH01. The initials matched Vincent Hale. The second document was a patient progress report, handwritten and initialed MP. The notes mentioned resistance, confusion, and partial memory regression. One line stood out, in uneven cursive. He keeps asking for his wife. He does not believe he is here willingly. He repeats his name constantly, as if afraid of losing it. Another file referenced a controlled simulation room, nicknamed the chapel, where subjects were monitored during transitions. The location matched the blueprints for the disused wing near the East Theater. Tara requested immediate access, and the search team was dispatched that afternoon. The chapel, as it turned out, was a narrow room with stained walls and a single observation mirror embedded in the far end. There were remnants of incense along the floor and a chair bolted to the center of the room. On the wall behind the mirror were symbols, crudely drawn in charcoal. 3 stars and a triangle. Beneath them, a sentence had been carved into the concrete. Not his body, not his breath, but his memory remains. Photographs taken at the scene were added to the investigation log. Forensic teams scoured the area for biological evidence. A partial fingerprint on the chair matched Vincent Hale's file, confirming he had been in that room. The sequence of events became more disturbing with every discovery. Vincent had been taken, drugged, subjected to experimental therapy designed to overwrite his personality. His memory was partially preserved, his identity possibly duplicated. Whoever became the new Vincent may have continued his life elsewhere, or perhaps was used as a placeholder, a tool to deflect suspicion. The real man was left behind, buried alive within the very system he had once served. Tara returned to the file marked with stars and noticed a final note clipped to the back. It was dated November 1981, 1 month after Vincent's disappearance. The note was written in a rushed, panicked hand. It said they cannot hold him much longer. The signals are bleeding through. He remembers the alley. He remembers the real door. We must contain the third. The handwriting did not match Gerald or Mei Lin. The team ran analysis and cross-referenced it with other archived samples. The closest match came from a janitor named Curtis Webb, who had worked night shifts during that era and had been terminated for psychiatric instability in 1982. When tracked down in a residential care facility in Spokane, Curtis, now in his late 70s, initially refused to speak. But after being shown a photograph of Vincent Hale, he stared at it for nearly a minute, then whispered that he used to see him after hours, walking the East Corridor, talking to someone no one else could see. Curtis said he once followed him and found him standing in the chapel room, speaking to the mirror. When he asked who was on the other side, Vincent had looked over his shoulder and replied with words Curtis never forgot. He said the third watches through reflection. He never blinks. He never sleeps. The third never leaves. Investigators began cross-referencing hospital deaths during that time, looking for patterns. They found 3 unexplained fatalities, all patients transferred to the East Wing for observation. All had received care from a team that included Gerald and Mei Lin. Their symptoms included confusion, rapid dissociation, and auditory hallucinations. The common thread in all their notes was the same line. Someone keeps whispering my name from the wall. The day the full autopsy report on Vincent Hale arrived, the mood in the temporary operations office shifted. A tension that had simmered quietly among investigators now thickened, stretching across each face as the lead forensic pathologist entered with a sealed envelope and laid it carefully on the long table. Tara Connors leaned forward in her chair as the folder was opened, her pen poised above her notebook, though she had stopped taking notes an hour ago. The report began with standard details. Time of discovery, physical state, estimated age and weight, identification confirmed by dental records and hospital ID. But as the pages turned and the data unfolded, it became clear that nothing about this case was standard. Vincent's body had not decayed at the rate expected for someone missing over 40 years. Certain tissues showed signs of preservation inconsistent with environmental conditions inside a sealed drawer. Most notably, a chemical residue had been detected in his bloodstream and bone marrow, one that slowed cellular deterioration. This residue, identified as a hybrid compound with botanical roots, resembled known sedative agents used in ancient herbal practices, particularly those linked to regions of southern China and Laos. While similar compounds had been observed in laboratory settings, the variant found in Vincent's body was synthetically altered, indicating human modification. The compound had properties that could dull synaptic response, reduce oxygen requirement, and induce long-term unconscious states. Tara recognized it immediately from the earlier recovered documents describing experimental trials. The most startling revelation, however, was neurological. A cranial scan revealed microscopic scarring in the prefrontal cortex and limbic system, as if electrodes had been used repeatedly over time. These scars were consistent with electrostimulation methods intended to weaken emotional resistance and suppress identity recall. Small metallic fragments, too minute for detection by the naked eye, were embedded in his upper spine, their composition suggesting an abandoned neural tagging technology developed in the early 80s for experimental mind interface studies. That technology had never advanced past early trials and had been shut down due to adverse effects. Yet here, inside the body of a vanished hospital doctor, was living proof it had been used outside of approved channels. The pathologist continued, his voice low but steady. Vincent's heart had failed due to arrhythmic shock, but the damage had occurred days after his exposure to the compound. There were signs of restrained movement, bruising on the wrists and ankles, suggesting that in his final hours he had struggled, perhaps regained awareness, only to realize his imprisonment. Near his ribcage, the telltale stitch still held fragments of the coarse thread. Its fiber analysis matched to one documented in a late 70s supply manifest from a private import company. That company had ties to overseas shipments processed through Hong Kong, where Mei Lin Park once studied medicine before arriving at St. Merida. Every piece pulled another layer back. Vincent had been turned into a prototype, not for medicine, not for healing, but for something more invasive, more sinister. He had been studied, drugged, observed, and finally silenced. But in those final moments, something had shifted. The bruises, the attempt to move, the trauma marks on the skin, all pointed to a moment of awakening. A final burst of consciousness before the body failed. Tara closed the folder gently, her fingers resting on the cover as though trying to feel the weight of what had been done. She asked the forensic team for one more test. She wanted to know if any genetic material remained viable enough to test for recent contact. Trace skin cells, hair follicles, anything that might suggest he was not alone in that drawer. Days later, the results returned. Among the identified DNA profiles was one unknown sample. Male. Not a match for any hospital employee. Not a match for Gerald Cross. Not a match for Curtis Webb or the limited record of Victor Hall. This unknown male DNA had been found beneath the fingernails of Vincent's right hand. The suggestion was clear. Before his death, Vincent had scratched or touched someone else. Someone alive. Someone nearby. With that revelation, Tara turned her focus to the psychiatric patient known as Victor Hall. She requested all surveillance tapes from the facility during the period of his admission. Many were destroyed, corrupted, or simply missing, but a few reels from early 1984 remained in cold storage. With the assistance of a university preservation lab, the grainy footage was stabilized and reviewed frame by frame. One clip, dated April 3rd, showed Victor pacing his cell. He paused near the observation window, lifted a hand slowly to his own face, and traced the line of his jaw as if comparing it to something unseen. Then, with sudden intensity, he scratched his forearm violently until he bled. The guards did not intervene. The notes for that day simply read patient exhibited persistent identity confusion, verbal repetition of conflicting names, refused food, requested mirror removed. A deeper dig into the facility's guest logs uncovered a pattern. Over a 6-week period, an unregistered visitor signed in under a different name each time, but always at the same hour, always requesting access to Victor. The descriptions varied slightly, but always mentioned a tall man with graying hair and an outdated medical bag. Facial composites based on these descriptions matched early photos of Gerald Cross. When confronted with this information, the psychiatric board issued a formal statement that policies had been reviewed and historical violations were being investigated. But it was too little, too late. Gerald Cross had disappeared in 1985. No trace. No known alias. No confirmed death. Only scattered notes, half-written journal pages, and a growing list of people whose lives had unraveled at his feet. The presence of an unknown male in Vincent's final moment, the overlapping DNA, the repeated visitation of Victor Hall by someone who matched Gerald's appearance, all pointed to one disturbing possibility. That Gerald had not vanished. He had embedded himself somewhere else, perhaps through another identity, perhaps through someone else entirely. And then came the anomaly. One of the technicians monitoring archival databases received an alert when a medical prescription was filled using credentials tied to Vincent Hale. The order had been placed online, filled in Spokane, under the patient name M. Geraldson. A new alias. A connected location. The name linked back to a recently discharged patient from a private care home. His intake records listed him as mute, suffering from acute aphasia and recurring hallucinations. But his medical chart showed an unusual recovery. Sudden spikes in cognitive response. Repetitive sketching of stars and surgical rooms. Phrases scrawled in notebooks left near his bed. One phrase repeated more than any other. The third is not done. When Tara reviewed the surveillance from that care home, one frame stood out. The man known as M. Geraldson staring directly into the hallway camera. His eyes were sunken, face thin, but familiar. Not as Gerald, not as Vincent, but as someone else. The bones of the face told one story. The eyes told another. Tara Connors stood in the municipal records office, surrounded by dust-coated boxes and old filing cabinets that hissed metallic complaints each time they were pulled open. The room had once been part of a larger archive before digital storage displaced paper and memory alike. Now it served as a final resting place for overlooked evidence and forgotten truths. Her hands moved with careful rhythm as she combed through documents labeled with outdated codes and misplaced names. She was looking for anything linked to Gerald Cross or Vincent Hale beyond the standard personnel files. What she needed was something unofficial. Something not meant for record-keeping, but retained out of fear or guilt or sheer compulsion. After 4 hours of digging, she found a box pushed deep into the bottom corner of a cabinet. It was unmarked, sealed with brittle tape and a fading hospital crest on one side. Inside were folders bound with string, each labeled only with dates. The first folder she opened was dated 3 days before Vincent's disappearance. Its contents were shocking in both what they revealed and what they implied. Typed memos exchanged between Gerald Cross and an unlisted administrator referenced psychological deviation metrics and phrases such as host identity drift and imprint latency. The language was clinical, but beneath its surface was a disturbing pattern. Names of patients appeared beside strings of code and numbers that did not match standard hospital identification. One such patient was listed as 04VH001. The date of admission was October 14, 1981. Notes indicated elevated resistance levels and strong memory retention. A line beneath that entry chilled Tara to her core. Dr. Hale continues to interfere with procedural integrity. Subject exposure must be adjusted accordingly. She flipped the page and found a photograph paperclipped to the corner. It showed Vincent standing near an examination bed, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Behind him stood a man in a patient gown with blurred features. The man's posture mimicked Vincent's in eerie synchronicity. The back of the photo read 04VH001. The implication was unmistakable. They had duplicated Vincent or tried to. Whether through drug-induced psychological programming or something even more elaborate, someone within the hospital had attempted to recreate his identity in another body. Another folder contained drawings sketched in pencil, abstract but deliberate. Eyes without pupils, surgical lamps floating in black space, outlines of the human spine etched with faint symbols. Each drawing was signed with the initials MP May Lynn Park had been documenting more than experiments. She had been recording visions. A torn journal entry near the bottom of the stack detailed something even more surreal. It referenced the East Theater, the chapel, and a sequence of numbers repeated over and over. 846721. Tara wrote the numbers down and scanned the room, unsure of their meaning but certain they were significant. She continued searching through the box until she found the last folder, dated months after Gerald's resignation. It was thinner than the others, containing a single sheet of paper, a resignation letter, but the signature line was blank. Instead, across the bottom in red ink, someone had scrawled the words, "He took the voice from me. I see him in mirrors. He wears them all now." Tara closed the box and left the building with a tight knot in her stomach. She returned to the operations center and shared the documents with the forensic analyst, who immediately ran the sequence of numbers through every known database. The result came back late that night. The numbers matched a restricted access code for the original hospital mainframe database stored on magnetic tape and sealed since the mid-80s. The tapes had been transferred years ago to a regional digital conversion facility for archival purposes. Tara traveled there the next morning and requested access under the active investigation clause. The technician led her to a back room where rows of magnetic reels sat organized by batch codes. Tape 846721 was stored on the bottom shelf, coated in dust, and housed in a black plastic casing. The technician loaded it into the reader, and the screen came alive with rows of green text on black background. The file directory was labeled third_protocol, and its subfolders were protected with outdated encryption that the technician bypassed with ease. Inside were audio logs, patient evaluations, and detailed session transcripts. One audio log stood out. It was titled Initial Overlay Session 1. The recording began with static, then a male voice, calm and firm, began speaking. This is Session 1 of the Overlay Integration Procedure. Subject, VH001. The voice asked a series of questions. What is your name? Where are you from? What is your purpose? A second voice responded slowly, hesitantly. My name is Vincent Hale. I work at St. Merida Memorial. I am a doctor. The first voice corrected him. No, you are a doctor. You are now the observer. You are the echo. The third will wear you. The questions resumed. The second voice grew more strained. The answers became confused. He began mixing details from two lives. In one, he was a physician. In the other, a patient waiting for release. The line between them blurred until he whispered, I am watching from within. The overlay was not merely experimental. It was successful. They had implanted aspects of Vincent into another. But the core identity resisted. Vincent's self-awareness endured longer than anticipated, disrupting the process and causing what the logs called emotional feedback degradation. The file concluded with a chilling entry. Subject unstable. Integration incomplete. Transfer postponed. Containment initiated. The word containment echoed in Tara's thoughts. They had not destroyed the failed subject. They had hidden him, sealed him in the drawer, preserved the evidence not for justice, but for future study. She exited the room and called the lead investigator. New warrants were issued. Locations connected to former hospital staff were revisited. During one of these visits, a retired orderly named Thomas Griggs admitted to storing old equipment in a shed behind his property. Inside the shed, beneath a tarp, was a steel trunk containing 6 cassette tapes, all labeled with session numbers. Tara reviewed them one by one. The last tape, labeled Final Entry VH001, began with silence. Then came a voice, raspy and broken. They opened the drawer last night. I saw them looking down. They think I am gone. But I am still inside. Not just the drawer. Inside him. The third is not alone. He is me now. He is us. The implications of the final tape played in Tara Connors's mind long after she left the orderly's shed and returned to her temporary office. She played the words back in her head repeatedly, not just the drawer inside him, he is me now, he is us. Each phrase struck her as more than metaphor. It was a statement of condition, a declaration of possession of merger. And that brought her back once again to the man known as Victor Hall, the patient once admitted under Vincent Hale's identity, the one who was found muttering contradictions and requesting that all mirrors be removed from his room. If the overlay procedure had created a living echo of Vincent, then Victor may have been that vessel. But if the process failed and Vincent's awareness fought to survive, what happened to the personality that was supposed to take over? What happened to the original Victor? Tara requested authorization to exhume Victor Hall's burial site, only to discover that there was no official death certificate, no confirmed place of burial, no obituary, no family statement. The patient known as Victor Hall had simply vanished from the record 1 year after admission. He was discharged under a different name, which was never updated in the hospital system. That name turned out to be Alan Meeks, a name used only once during an interfacility transfer to a remote convalescence center in northern Idaho. Tara made the call herself, requesting access to Alan Meeks's patient file. After a tense conversation with the administrator who was hesitant to disclose information about a long-discharged patient, Tara was granted a brief window to view the archived records on site. She drove for nearly 6 hours through winding forest roads, reaching a gray stone facility nestled between ridges and evergreen walls. The air was colder there, sharper, cleaner, as if untouched by the rot of time and corruption that had festered at St. Merida. The director of the center met her at the gate and escorted her to the basement archive. A single box awaited her on the desk marked AM 1972 to 1991. Inside were typed logs, progress notes, and incident reports. The earliest entries described Alan Meeks as compliant, cooperative, and mostly silent. He responded well to music therapy, but poorly to cognitive recall exercises. Then came the shift. Within 3 months, his behavior changed drastically. He began referring to himself in the third person, reciting medical terminology, and requesting to be called Dr. Hale. A progress note from June 1985 stated the patient insists on conducting rounds with other patients, identifies staff by incorrect names, and mimics the speech patterns of a neurologist. A second entry from the same month noted increased aggression when interrupted while writing. One phrase appears repeatedly in red ink scrawled at the margins of nearly every page. "I am the third, I remember what he forgot." Tara flipped through the final pages and stopped at a hand-drawn map, with 3 stars marked on what appeared to be a hospital floor plan. Underneath the sketch was a single line in pencil written with deliberate slowness. "He did not die in the drawer he climbed out into me." Her breath caught as she realized the floor plan was not from St. Merida, but from a separate facility, one that had burned down in 1993. Cross-referencing the layout with fire department records, she discovered the location matched a psychiatric observation wing outside Missoula, Montana, once used for high-risk memory disorder patients. The cause of the fire had never been confirmed, though several patients were evacuated. None of them were identified publicly. It was assumed all survivors were relocated, but no list had ever been produced. The pattern was becoming undeniable. A second patient had not only received Vincent's memories, but had become something else, a fusion of identities, both original and imposed. This fractured consciousness was no longer limited to one host. It had traveled from Vincent to Victor and possibly into others. The overlay process was never designed to stop at one transfer. It was a chain reaction, a spreading imprint infecting minds like a virus that rewrote the host with each iteration. Tara traced the movement of the identity through archived admissions, noting similar behavior in 3 additional patients across 2 decades, each of them referencing surgical lamps, mirrors, voices, and walls, and the phrase "the third is me." In every case, records were redacted or destroyed shortly after admission. The implications were devastating. This was no longer a question of what happened to Vincent Hale. This was now about containment. Who else carried fragments of him? Who else had been exposed to the original protocol? And more pressingly, who controlled it now? Tara returned to her notes and began constructing a timeline not just of the known events, but of the gaps, the years where nothing was reported, but behavioral patterns emerged in scattered facilities. There was a rhythm to it, a cycle of silence followed by chaos, always centered around a new patient with no family, no confirmed identity, and always ending in disappearance. She marked each incident with a red pin on her wall map and noticed that every 10 years, without fail, a flare occurred. Vincent Hale vanished in 1981. Victor Hall admitted in 1984. Alan Meeks documented in 1985 and vanishes by 1991. The Montana fire erupts in 1993. Then a blank space until 2003, when a patient in Oregon began referring to himself as the one they sealed. Then again in 2013, when another in Nevada drew stars on every wall of his room. Now it was 2024. Something was coming again. Something old was preparing to surface. Tara compiled a list of medical professionals who had worked in facilities connected to these patients. One name surfaced repeatedly: a psychologist named Harold Nix. He had changed institutions frequently, but always landed near one of the flare sites. Records showed he had once been a research assistant to Gerald Cross, though he had never been formally tied to the overlay program. She reached out through professional networks and found he was currently consulting for a sleep study clinic outside Sacramento. She made contact through a receptionist and scheduled a visit under the pretense of interviewing him for a medical podcast on memory retention. When she arrived, the clinic felt sterile and modern, full of clean lines and white noise machines. Dr. Nix was polite, reserved, and methodical. He answered questions calmly until Tara mentioned Vincent Hale. At the name, his eyes twitched. Just slightly. He asked her to repeat the question. She watched him closely, noting how his hands began to tremble ever so faintly as he reached for his water glass. She pressed further, asked about his work with Cross and whether he had heard of the third protocol. He stood abruptly and said the interview was over. But as he turned to leave, his reflection in the glass door caught her attention. It was off by a fraction. His lips moved, but his mouth stayed closed. A second face, barely perceptible, flickered behind his eyes. She stood frozen as he exited. Then she wrote 3 words in her notebook. "He is carrying." Tara Connors sat alone in her apartment long after sunset, the city lights of Sacramento flickering against her windows like distant sparks of something trying to reach her through the dark. The words she had written in her notebook hours earlier glared back at her with brutal simplicity: "He is carrying." She replayed the conversation with Harold Nix in her mind again and again, the shifting in his voice, the stillness in his eyes, the ripple in his reflection. It was no longer about investigation. It was survival. If Nix had inherited the third, if that presence had now taken root inside him, then the cycle was continuing as planned, and she had just stepped into its radius. She needed to act quickly before the awareness inside Nix realized how much she knew. The overlay was never about replication. It was transmission, a slow, careful evolution of memory, and will growing through bodies like a parasitic chain of identities feeding on one another. And Tara realized something she had missed. Every transfer had followed contact. A doctor, a nurse, a counselor, a technician, someone close enough to absorb the fragments through conversation, through shared experience, through a memory told one too many times. She had spent too long interviewing, too long reading journals and listening to tapes, and now she feared it was no longer just Nix who carried it. The next morning, she contacted Detective Rayner, the lead investigator still assigned to the Hale case. She explained her findings with careful detail, outlining the timeline of identity fractures and the recurring presence of key personnel near flare events. She described her encounter with Nix and her growing suspicion that the third was no longer just a personality, but a transmittable force of viral consciousness passed through memory itself. Rayner was skeptical at first, but his tone changed when Tara forwarded her compiled map with the 10-year intervals and matching psychiatric incidents. He had seen some of those cases before during unrelated investigations and had dismissed them as institutional anomalies. Now they formed a pattern. They met later that afternoon at a secure unit in the Sacramento Police Department, where Tara presented the files she had retrieved from the Idaho Center and the audio tapes from the Montana Fire Archives. Rayner listened silently as the voices from the past filled the room with fragmented truths and whispered warnings. When the final tape ended, he stood slowly and said they would need help. He arranged for a federal liaison to be briefed, and within 2 days a task force was formed quietly operating under a mental health crimes division. They began tracking Harold Nix's movements, compiling data on every patient and colleague he had interacted with in the past decade. What emerged was chilling. Several of those individuals had either gone missing, suffered breakdowns, or reported auditory hallucinations involving mirrors, corridors, or medical lamps. 2 of them had been institutionalized and had drawn repeated images of 3 stars arranged in a triangle. One woman, now catatonic, had carved the words "He sees through me" into her forearm repeatedly before slipping into silence. Tara proposed an idea that at first sounded implausible. If the third passed through memory, then what if the original point of infection had not been Vincent Hale, but something deeper embedded in Gerald Cross and merely expressed through Vincent? The overlay may have been a vessel for something older, something Cross discovered or created and then attempted to pass on. They traced Cross's academic history back to a study abroad year in northern Thailand during the early 70s, where he had spent months working with shamans and botanical researchers cataloging properties of ritual plants used in local ceremonies. One of those plants identified in Cross's notes matched the compound found in Vincent's body. And within a notebook now preserved in a university archive, Cross had written a passage in the margins of a chemical chart. The body forgets the name, but the memory lives. I brought him here. He followed. This confirmed Tara's fear. The third was not born in the hospital. It had arrived long before. The experiment with Hale had not created it, but instead attempted to give it permanence through science. Gerald had become the first anchor, Hill the second, Victor the third, and now Nix. The task force moved quickly to bring Nix in under the guise of questioning for a past medical ethics complaint, but when officers arrived at his residence, the house was empty. No signs of forced exit. No packed bags. Just a turned-off lamp beside a single open journal page where one phrase was written 20 times. He is here again. He is watching from my skin. A neighbor reported seeing Nix walk out 2 nights earlier carrying nothing but a bag of books. Surveillance cameras caught him boarding a bus headed north. He had not used any credit cards since. The search widened. Tara requested access to Cross's old belongings, which had been stored by his estranged brother in a storage unit outside Tacoma. Inside, she found boxes of books, journals, and 1 locked steel case. With legal clearance, the case was opened, revealing a reel of Super 8 film, a sealed envelope, and a series of black and white photographs. The envelope contained a letter written by Cross dated 1984, addressed to no one. It read, "He can move now, through sound, through thought, through touch. I did not bind him, I gave him passage." The film showed a ritual performed in a jungle, clearing three figures standing around a man seated on a stool, his face painted with ashes, eyes wide open, unblinking. One figure stood behind the camera, giving instructions in English and Thai. That voice matched an old university lecture given by Cross. The images were grainy, but in one frame the ash-covered man opened his mouth, and another voice emerged, deep, foreign, vibrating with multiple tones. The tape cut out mid-sentence. Tara knew they had no time. The entity referred to as the third was not random. It was selective. It chose those who studied memory, those who worked with the mind, those who opened themselves to others. She stared at her own notebook filled with dates, names, and voices. She had repeated Vincent's story so many times that parts of it had begun to echo in her thoughts unprompted. She had not dreamt her own dreams in weeks, only hospital corridors and blinking fluorescent lights and cold steel drawers. That night she sat in front of her bathroom mirror, holding the final photograph found in Cross's case. It showed a man's reflection in a cracked mirror with someone else's hand on his shoulder, though no second person stood behind him. She stared at her own reflection, trying to discern any movement that did not match her own. When her eyes finally blinked a full second after her reflection had done, so she dropped the photograph and stepped back. Somewhere in her mind a new voice whispered a name she had never said aloud. Not his name, her own. Tara Connors left her apartment before sunrise and walked the empty city streets in silence. Her mind no longer able to separate her thoughts from the voices she now heard whispering softly along the edge of each memory she recalled. She told herself it was exhaustion, a residue of the long investigation, the images, the documents, the audio tapes playing in a mental loop she could not break, but a deeper instinct warned her this was not fatigue. This was infiltration. She stopped beside a shuttered bookstore and stared into the glass, where her reflection stared back at her just a moment too late. The timing was subtle, nearly imperceptible, but it confirmed what she had felt since the moment she saw Harold Nix walk through the glass door at the clinic. Something had crossed into her. It had used her attention, her voice, her grief over the people lost to this thing, and now it sat just beneath her own awareness, like a shadow cast behind her thoughts, waiting for the moment she would stop resisting. She checked into a hotel under a false name and locked her phone in a drawer, using only an offline notebook to track her thoughts. She drew stars on the first page, then burned it. She wrote her name 20 times, then scratched it out each time before the ink dried. She tried not to think of Vincent Hale or Gerald Cross, or the chapel room with its single chair bolted to the floor. She tried not to remember the cold whisper from the tape where the voice had said, "I am still inside." But the memories came anyway, uninvited and increasingly altered. She would recall walking the basement hallways of the hospital, but now saw herself through a third perspective, not watching, but being watched by something following just behind her shoulder, never visible, but always implied. She began to lose time in minutes at first, then hours. She would find herself seated in rooms she had no recollection of entering, notes written in her handwriting but addressed to people she did not know. In one instance, she woke in a parked car in front of a building she recognized from Cross's university records, a place he had lectured about memory mapping and semantic overlay. She had not planned to come there. No itinerary placed her in that part of town. Her notebook on the passenger seat held a line she did not remember writing. "He remembers you. He is choosing you." Tara returned to the task force office and requested temporary withdrawal from the active investigation, citing mental fatigue and emotional burnout. They accepted without protest. She suspected they too had begun to sense something wrong in her voice, a slight delay in her cadence, a different rhythm in the way she now spoke about the case. She spent the next 3 days reviewing footage from the old hospital again, pausing every frame that showed Vincent's reflection in mirrors or glass. In every instance, the reflection did not match the position of his body. Sometimes it faced forward when he looked down. Sometimes it blinked when his eyes were open. She compiled these into a private file labeled Distortions and compared them to footage of the patients who followed. Victor Hall, Alan Meeks, the woman in Oregon. In each video, at least one reflection acted independently of the person casting it. The conclusion was no longer theoretical. The third was not just a presence. It was parasitic intelligence manifesting visually through a reflection vector, a gateway that allowed its awareness to split from the host and watch others, to select new carriers through visual resonance. Tara knew this explained the obsession with mirrors and glass among those affected. It was not vanity or confusion. It was terror. They were being watched not by others, but by themselves, or rather the thing now riding inside them. She decided to test her own exposure. She visited a university lab late at night using an old ID credential to access a mirror box experiment used in perception studies. Inside the small controlled chamber, she sat surrounded by reflective panels and recorded herself for 2 continuous hours. When she reviewed the footage, her blood ran cold. The first 37 minutes showed nothing unusual, but at the 38th minute, her reflection in the right panel blinked twice while she remained motionless. Then the mouth opened slightly and formed a word without sound. A single syllable. Stay? Tara rewound and replayed the moment, but each time her body reacted with the same primal fear, as if something ancient had recognized its next vessel. She shut down the machine, deleted the footage from the main server, and locked the room behind her. She knew she could not stop the third. It had already begun replication inside her, but she could try to understand its limitations. It had spread through proximity, through shared trauma, through stories told too often and memories reshaped by obsession. But it had not yet fully overwritten her. Her voice was still her own. Her thoughts, though invaded, still contained lines of resistance. She needed to know how long she had left. She returned to the archives and pulled the full journal of May Lynn Park, which had been sealed due to its erratic entries. In the final pages, she described experiencing temporal dislocation, seeing events before they occurred, dreaming conversations that had not yet taken place. She wrote about mirrors cracking when she stood in front of them and shadows that moved counter to the light. One phrase appeared at the bottom of the final page. He comes through echo, not voice. He cannot exist without a listener. This became Tara's last hope. If the third needed an audience, then isolation could delay its development. She unplugged all electronics, blacked out every window, and remained alone without mirrors or reflective surfaces. She spoke to no one. She wrote nothing. She recorded no sounds. She let her thoughts become whispers too faint for the thing inside her to grasp. Days passed, then a week. She began to feel herself return to the surface. The whispers dulled. The reflections matched. She allowed herself a moment of belief that the strategy had worked. But then the letter arrived, slid under her door. No envelope. Just one page with a message in red ink. You stopped speaking. So I spoke instead. The handwriting was hers. Tara Connors stood in the center of the old hospital chapel once more. The air was still as if it held its breath with her. Dust hung motionless in the slant of morning light that slipped between boarded windows, and the iron scent of age rose from the concrete like a memory returning uninvited. She had come here alone, not out of courage, but necessity. No camera, no tape, no mirror, no record. Just her presence and the knowledge that silence might no longer be protection, but a weapon. After the letter arrived, she understood the truth. The third did not speak to frighten. It spoke to fill. It needed to be heard because the moment it was heard it became more real. More than a thought. More than a voice. It became a weight in the world. A thing with roots. A thing with shape. And if it could not be heard by others, it would be heard by the host. By the body it rode like a parasite that fed on resonance. Tara had spent the last 2 weeks doing nothing but listening. Not speaking. Not writing. Just hearing what it said when it thought she was not fighting. She learned its rhythm. Its tone. Its stories. It did not lie in the way humans lied. It bent truth the way water bends around stone. It never claimed to be evil. It only claimed to be needed. It whispered of moments it had witnessed not from one life, but many. It remembered how Gerald stood in the clearing in Thailand and said the word aloud for the first time. It remembered how Vincent lay beneath the lamp and muttered his wife's name until it took that too. It remembered each hand that had touched it and each voice that had called it forward. But what it remembered most were the silences. The empty spaces between the thoughts. The fractures. That was where it began. Not in language, but in pause. Not in story, but in forgetting. And Tara realized then what no file or tape or record had shown. The third was not created. It was invited. It came where identity weakened, where grief opened too wide, where memory blurred the edge between what was real and what was wanted. Gerald did not make it. He let it in. He left the door open just long enough. And the hospital with its dead patients and shuttered wings and missing doctors was not its origin. It was just the first place someone listened long enough to let it speak fully. She walked to the chair bolted to the chapel floor and sat without ceremony. Her hands rested on her knees, her eyes fixed on the surgical lamp above. She did not flinch when the room grew colder. She did not blink when her reflection in the polished metal slowly turned its head while hers remained still. Instead, she whispered the only thing she had not said since this began. "I know you were there." The shift was immediate, not in the room, but inside her, like a rush of warmth behind the eyes, a stillness in the lungs. Her mind did not flood with visions or scream in foreign languages. It simply remembered. It remembered every moment of her life with perfect clarity. The sound of her mother's voice on the day her father left. The color of the sky the morning she graduated. The smell of the pages in the book that made her want to become a journalist. The pressure of time collapsed, and for the first time, she saw her story whole. And the third waited. It had no need to speak because now it understood she would not carry it. Not out of resistance, but out of wholeness. She was not a fracture. She was not an echo chamber. She had nothing to hide, and so nothing to surrender. She saw now how each of the others had been chosen. Not at random, but because they carried silence inside them. Spaces where memory had failed, where shame had made them forget, where guilt had made them blind. The third needed those silences like seeds need soil. But Tara had none left. She had faced her own story. She had named it, claimed it, not rewritten it, just owned it. And so the voice inside her faded not in anger, but in retreat. It did not scream. It did not burn. It simply uncoiled and stepped back into the quiet from which it had come. She exhaled, just once, just deeply enough to feel the weight lift. She stood and walked from the chapel without looking back. Outside, the sun was sharp and unfiltered. The city moved like it had before. No one knew what had happened in that room, and she would never tell them. There was no need. There would be no files, no article, no story, because the moment it was spoken it could begin again. She understood the risk now, the danger of naming the thing that feeds on being known. She would not give it that power. Months passed, then years. The task force disbanded. The case closed again quietly and forever. People forgot. They always did. But Tara remembered, not out of fear, but out of duty. And when a young journalist came to her one day asking about the old hospital and the rumors, she only smiled and said some stories are best left quiet. Some silences are not empty. They are full. And then she walked away. Her steps light, her breath steady, her story hers alone. The echo did not return, because there was no room left for it. The end is not that the third was defeated. The end is that it was denied, not with fire or force, but with truth. And truth is not loud. It is still. It waits inside the ones who refuse to forget, and remembers for those who have the courage to listen without ever needing to speak. If this story gave you chills or made you think twice about your own reflections, hit like and consider subscribing for more true-style mysteries. What part of the plot stuck with you most? And where in the world are you watching from? Drop a comment below. I read every one.